Hello, my name is Anna Barker, and we are discussing volume 2 of the Misérables today. We had a lot of fun with our volume 1 discussion. I read your comments, and I'm very happy that the volume 1 discussion initiated a discussion among the readers, which is terrific. That's all a teacher wants to know, that after a conversation, everyone was still thinking about the topic of the conversation. And as I mentioned while I was chatting to you informally, volume 2 of The Misérables is pretty much my favorite volume. That doesn't mean that volumes 3, 4, and 5 will not offer intellectual fireworks and emotional contentment. They are massive, and you can tell that we are trying to stay afloat at this point in volume 3. It is so hard because so much is going on, and some of the chapters are enormous. And Victor Hugo tosses in so much historical information that we are overwhelmed. I mean, the past 2 weeks I've been completely overwhelmed with everything that is happening in the novel. But volume 2 is just so beautifully balanced. We have the glorious beginning of the volume was the description of the Battle of the Waterloo, and he doesn't stray too far into various areas of academic inquiry. He stays with the Battle of Waterloo, and he stays with his long essay on convents. And those are the two grounding essays of volume 2. Beyond that, it's just beautiful development of all of the characters' lives and psychological drama at its highest peak when Jean Valjean resurfaces. Do you remember how exciting the end of volume 1 is? Our main character just disappears, poof, and he's gone. And also you notice that the volumes are dedicated to certain characters, and so you're wondering how come that Jean Valjean is such a huge part of volume 1 and such a huge part of volume 2, but it's volume 5 that is entitled Jean Valjean. And of course, Fantine is the title of the first volume, and she's sadly gone at this point. Cosette is dedicated to volume 2, and you're wondering, is Cosette going to resurface at some point later on in the novel? And then volume 3 is entitled Marius. And we have a brand new character, a brand new set of family drama. And so we are continuing with that plot line in volume 3. But in volume 2, we're staying with the characters we encountered in volume 1. It's Cosette, it's Jean Valjean, and it's the Thénardier family. And the drama that unfolds with Valjean's rescue of this poor child who was slaving away at her very, very young age, the sweet little lark who was I love the way Jean Valjean describes children. He is not sentimental about describing children. Cosette is not idealized as a child. She's overwhelmed, but she's a liar. She's a sweet little liar. She lies so many times. Remember when she's sent into the cold, into the dark with that bucket? It's Christmas Eve, and the poor child is, 1, not getting any presents. 2, is shivering in an old chemise and an old skirt. And 3, she's being told by Madame Thénardier, who really is like a fabulous French ogress. She is lifted out of French folklore, and like this full-size giantess who is absolutely only one redeeming quality. She likes to read novels, but they have messed with her mind so tremendously. And the only outcome of her reading of novels are the strange exotic names that she gives to her daughters, Eponine and Azelma. But this ogress is sending the poor child into the woods because, and I love how Victor Hugo tells us a little bit of information about how clean water was supplied to these small towns before clean water pipes were delivered for the benefit of the community. Just please recall that Victor Hugo is very interested in plumbing all the way to the sewers of Paris. So we find out that in this town, if you did not procure enough fresh water for drinking for the night, you have to go to the source. And so that horrible thing happens to Cosette. And when one of the customers of the Thénardier Inn says, has my horse been watered? Cosette immediately says, yes, yes, monsieur, I gave the water to the horse myself. I mean, she's lying. She's absolutely lying. So Cosette is a very sweet child, but she's not idealized. She's not a piece of beautifully wrapped candy. She's real, and that's why those chapters that are dedicated to her um, rescue, to her apotheosis almost. She's taken from a place of death and degradation to a place of love and kindness, and they're not sweetie sweet. And so she lies, and Madame Thénardier catches her lying, and Madame Thénardier is furious. And the child does go out into the night, but this child has an agenda. She loves the beautiful doll, and she's walking past the Christmas stalls, she knows that she has to hurry to get that water from the woods, but she lingers, she loiters. Oh my goodness, we have a lying, loitering, lively child on our hands. And that's the beauty of Cosette at this age. She's real. That's the way children behave. If you were to send a child out into the darkness on Christmas Eve to get a bucket of water, they will lie to you, and they will be completely entitled to their lying. And then that moment where there's just almost this electric shock that passes through both Cosette and Jean Valjean when he grabs the bucket. And it's a terrifying moment. I mean, once again, it's one of those moments lifted out of French fairy tales or Brothers Grimm fairy tales, which are not sweetie sweet. If you ever read the real versions of Grimm fairy tales, it's not something that you want to read to a 3-year-old, because they are going to have nightmares for the rest of their lives. So there is that serious, terrible sense of nightmare when a strange, tall, enormous, and you have to remember, always remember, Jean Valjean has a very imposing physique. He is very tall and he's very strong. And so this imposing, dark human being looms out of the wilderness of the woods and grabs Cosette's bucket. And it's fascinating. She doesn't immediately act protective of the bucket. She doesn't say, oh, monsieur, this is my bucket, and I'm doing this good deed, and go away. She just gives him the bucket. I mean, she's a real child. She's not sweetie sweet. She's like, okay, well, I'm in a dark wood with a stranger, but he's carrying my bucket. So, my life is so full of misery that this little tiny bit of misery lifted from my shoulders. I'm grateful for it. And so she comes in, and of course she dropped the money that was in her little pocket for the purchase of the loaf of bread. And what does she say immediately to Madame Thénardier? Oh, the bakery was closed. And Madame Thénardier is furious with her, but Cosette is very clever. Not only is she's a sweet little liar, but she's very clever, and she knows that Madame Thénardier would forgive her for not purchasing the bread if she brought a paying customer. So she immediately says, oh, but Madame, I brought someone who was looking for a place to stay, which immediately quells Madame Thénardier's fury. And I love that chapter title. Some of you pointed out how clever the Victor Hugo chapter titles are. And one of the cleverest title is How to Serve a Pauper Who May Be a Wealthy Person, because Jean Valjean seems to be a person who would not be able to pay for anything, but he seems to be producing all of these gold coins. And so Thénardier is observing him. Note that he is sitting with the drinkers, and it's Christmas Eve and somebody has got to party. But he, out of the corner of his eye, he's watching the stranger. So Thénardier is always calculating a few steps ahead of time. It never works for him in the long run. He always loses on all of his ventures and adventures. And I promise not to talk about volume 3, but we have Thénardier chapters from hell coming in chapter 3. So be prepared for trials and tribulations coming very, very soon. But Thénardier is watching this man, and he sees, Jean Valjean sees Cosette darning stockings, and it's Christmas Eve, and he just feels like, well, you know what, somebody has got to play at some point. And so he asks Thénardier, why is this child working? And Thénardier is saying, well, who else is going to darn my stockings? And what do you expect? She is, she's an orphan, and we are being charitable to her, so she has to earn her keep. And Jean Valjean asked how much would it be to purchase her labor. And Thénardier gives an amount, and Jean Valjean, without any questions asked, gives the money and tells the child, go and play, which is something that Cosette has never heard in her entire life. And I also want, so we talked about the, beautiful historical asides that Victor Hugo just lavishes on us throughout the novel, and all of the historical and philosophical and theological and political essays that he writes. But also we need to mention that it is a book about economics. And so much of the book is actually dedicated to how economies work. Remember, Jean Valjean comes to this town and he starts a factory because he's really, really good at producing a product efficiently and cheaply, but still making a profit. And he dedicates the money that he gains, the enormous amount of profit that he gains from this manufacturing process, to bettering the town. There's a hospital, there's a girls' school, there's a boys' school. Remember, Victor Hugo was an advocate for childhood education, and you can see how much he always talks about childhood education when he talks about the homeless children of Paris, about Gavroche, about the Friends of the ABC. I mean, they are dedicated to teaching the proletariat to read. And so Fantine could not read, and that's why her economic prospects were so poor. But at one point in volume 1, we are told that Fantine loved working because getting money for earnest labor makes you happy. So that is a very, very pro-entrepreneurial spirit and pro-economic development passage. But also note that when now Jean Valjean, who saved all of his money, remember all of that talk about the devil appearing at a certain village was a pick and a spade. And we have to remember that this devil appears every once in a while in this community. So somehow this is connected to Jean Valjean and his money. And remember, there were about 600,000 francs that he saved, that he managed to withdraw from the bank before he was rearrested. So once again, economic relationship come into this give and take between Jean Valjean and the Thénardier family. So he asks, how much is her labor? And when Thénardier says the price, Jean Valjean just gives him the money, and he pays for Cosette's free time. And so it's a very fascinating economic exchange over this child who's all of a sudden allowed to play. And then that chapter where the Thénardier girls all of a sudden start nursing a cat, and they just basically grab this cat and they start, because cats are so much more fun than inanimate dolls. And those of you who, I mean, like, children love to grab bunnies and kitties and puppies and put them in strollers and push them around because they are real, they are alive, they do things, you have to struggle with them, they are like babies. And so all of a sudden the Thénardier girls are fascinated with this kitten, and they start dressing it. And until their doll became available, I mean, strangely enough, Cosette was rocking a little sword. She has a tiny little sword, and I've seen children, rock inanimate objects that have no nurturing aspects at all whatsoever. The children just love to cuddle. I mean, my daughter used to just put anything that is soft and cuddly right here under her chin, and just would go like this because she just wanted to cuddle just a sweet little something that was soft. But with Cosette, it was a little knife, a little sword. She had nothing else to cuddle. And so when she sees the Thénardier girls completely absorbed at babying a kitty, she grabs the doll. And so she goes through 15 minutes of absolute bliss, sitting under the table and loving that doll so much that the doll's foot dangles from under the table, and the Thénardier girls are vicious. And they just absolutely go after Cosette. And Madame Thénardier says, see what happens when the distribution of labor in this inn all of a sudden falls apart. There is squabbling between the girls because Cosette's free time is putting her in conflict with the engagement of the Thénardier daughters. So it's a fascinating moment. At which point the stranger, the mysterious stranger, just walks out of the inn and comes back with a doll. It's not just a doll, it's the doll that all of the little children of the community were just admiring. And it's Christmas Eve, and here comes this mysterious stranger with the most beautiful doll ever, and he gives it to Cosette. And so once again, the economic relationships shifted one more time. Who is this pauper who is giving royal gifts to Cosette? And I love what Victor Hugo does at that point. It's just such a beautiful sentence, sweet and expresses everything. He said, somebody might have just said to Cosette, now you're the Queen of France. It's just that moment of just gaining that amazing gift. It was similar for Cosette in her station in life, as if somebody would have told her, you're the Queen of France. And so Cosette is overwhelmed with delight. And she then goes to sleep, and Jean Valjean examines the fireplace. And of course, the loving mother, who seems to only love daughters. Remember, there's a baby screaming in the back room in volume 2, and that baby is a boy, because Madame Thénardier's love extended only to her daughters, but not to her sons. And keep that in mind. We will keep encountering that strange phenomenon of that mother throughout the novel, actually. And so Jean Valjean, I'm actually thinking of just reading this chapter. We usually read Child's Christmas in Wales on Christmas Eve. And I just said to the family, you know what, we're not reading Child's Christmas in Wales this year. We're reading this chapter from the Misérables, because it is so beautiful. And there's that sense, somebody mentioned in the comments, is she Cinderella? There is an aspect of Cinderella in Cosette, because he finds her little wooden clog that is all split and muddy and chipped, and he finds it deep in the fireplace. And Victor Hugo once again says, there is never a child in this world who doesn't hope somewhere deep down in their hearts. And that little split, muddy clog deep in the chimney represented hope. And it's just the hope of goodness in people. And he puts gold coins into that little clog, and it is just absolutely magical. And then he walks out, and he brings little mourning clothes for Cosette, because he just feels that she's walking out of this time of sorrow into the time of uncertainty. He does not know how his life will shape up with this child. Victor Hugo very sweetly points out to us that he was 27 when he was arrested and sent to jail for the first time, when he becomes Dufour 601. He loved his sister's children, but they just, over the 19 years of imprisonment, he's even stopped thinking about them. They were just not, even though they were the cause of his imprisonment, they were not relevant in any way, shape, or form in his life. He heard rumors that maybe just one of those children survived, and that his sister moved from the countryside, you know, one of these uneducated peasants who finds menial labor in the city, and the poor child had to sit in the cold and wait for the school to open. I mean, just and some of you are commenting on the fact that the harshness of childhood in this time period is just so brutally depicted by Victor Hugo. So he understands the horror of child neglect in this bygone era. And so he gives Cosette little mourning clothes because she's coming out of sadness, and she's going into uncertainty. There's no puffy pink gowns for the little princess. She just has Catherine, her beautiful doll. And I love the description of Catherine. It took me about an hour to find the perfect illustration for that comment. I mean, sometimes I write up my comment and then I think, and what am I going to post? Like for the comment from 2 days ago, I just couldn't find an illustration. And then I thought, oh, and Madame Plutarch has a cat who could have meowed the Misérables in the Sistine Chapel. I just thought, well, fine, if a cat can meow it, we can listen to it. So that's why I ended up, and you loved it. So it was an act of desperation because I couldn't think of a single image to post, but that doll took forever. And when I found that doll finally, and it was a very detailed description of the doll, and it was on authentic mid-19th century French doll. And everything was just the way Victor Hugo described, including blonde, real hair. I just thought, well, this is it. this is one of those hurrah moments. And so they walk out of the sadness, and it's amazing because Thénardier, who just, I mean, he fleeced Jean Valjean. He just charged him just extraordinary amounts of money for that stay. And he chases after them because it's not enough. And that sense of the menacing figure of Jean Valjean, because when he is out in the woods, when he is away from restrictions of civilization, he is terrifying. That when he encounters Cosette in the woods, there's a terrifying presence in Jean Valjean. And so when he encounters Thénardier in the woods, Thénardier feels that this man is menacingly huge physically. But Thénardier just is doing his thing, and then Jean Valjean produces the piece of paper where Fantine signed. She could not write, but she could sign. And she signed a piece of paper saying that this man will be responsible for Cosette. Please hand Cosette into the care of this man and pay for all expenses. And Jean Valjean just says, you have no legal claim at all whatsoever, because I have the piece of paper proving that she's my child at this point, that I'm responsible for her. And I paid all of the bills that you presented. We're done. And then him grasping the walking stick that he has was just such a terrifying moment in Thénardier's life, that he just sort of felt like I'd better withdraw. And they go to the place where people disappear, and that, of course, is Paris. It's so much easier to disappear in the middle of a huge city than in the countryside, where everybody's nosy, everybody asks questions. There are all of those eternal grandmothers who sit on benches in small villages and towns and gossip, gossip, gossip. They would know everything in no time. I mean, this is stressed over and over and over again in all the novels that glorify the horrors of the large metropolis. Sherlock Holmes stories always stress the fact that it's so much easier to get lost in London than anywhere else. Same with Charles Dickens' novels. All of the London novels just stress the fact that you disappear in London and you disappear for good. Same with Dostoevsky's novels. You blend in the city because nobody wants to know the answers, because the answers are so unpleasant. And so they manage to disappear. But then Jean Valjean cannot stop being the one who has been called. And literally his encounter with the Bishop of Dean, it was a calling. He was tapped on the shoulder by an angel, and that angel said, and now you go forth and be perfect. And do you remember we talked about the fact that Jean Valjean rages in the wilderness after being called? He does not want to be good. We do not want to be good. Being good is so hard. It's a responsibility. You always have to watch yourself. You always have to mind yourself. You always have to think of doing good things, and you don't want to do good things because it's so tedious and it's so time consuming. And so Jean Valjean rages against being called to be good because it's a restriction that you place on yourself. You are held up to a higher standard, and the person who is holding you up to a higher standard is you yourself. It's just, I mean, the Bishop of Dean. Do you remember how much I love that statement that Victor Hugo says about the Bishop of Dean, that he never held virtue outside of people's reach? He did not expect anything from people that he knew they could not deliver. And this was his enormous gamble. Jean Valjean was his greatest gamble, the greatest gamble of his life, because he asked this man for something that the Bishop of Dean could not imagine this man could deliver. He was completely honest about being a convict, but also that Jean Valjean could not deliver. I mean, Jean Valjean did not think that he had it in him to be this good man. And so it's almost a curse. It is a curse because it's fascinating how he settles in with Cosette and Jean Valjean, and Victor Hugo tells us that, you know, he was a 27-year-old man when he was arrested. He didn't have a sweetheart because he was working to support his sister after she became a widow and the 7 children. And he never had a sweetheart. He never had a love. He was never a lover. He was never a husband. He was never a father. And all of those aspects of his humanity atrophied over the years. And then he was handed this moment in life. And it seems that everything that he has done in the past, which was very economically driven, and economics and free enterprise and capitalist development, allowed him to help many. And then all of a sudden, the eternal being tapped him on the shoulder and said, and now you will help just one. And it's fascinating how that same choice has to be made by Jean Valjean at the end of volume 1, right? Because he has to make a decision whether I'm going to be the benefactor of an entire community. And he keeps saying to himself, you know, if there is a fire in anyone's home, I did that. If there is a pot of soup over that fire in anyone's home, I did that. How can I trade the livelihood and the prosperity of an entire community for one worthless human being, for that prisoner in Arras who is considered to be me? Let him rot in hell. He probably deserves it. And look at me, I've become a good man. I've done everything that the Bishop of Digne asked me to do. How can I trade my goodness that benefits an entire community for his not so goodness? And that choice is impossible for Jean Valjean, but he makes that choice. And now all of a sudden, after his second imprisonment, he comes in contact with this little sweet baby Cosette. And all of a sudden he's tapped on the shoulder by the eternal being. And he said, and now save just one, this one. And Cosette starts crying every time he kisses her hands. She does not know anything about kindness. He doesn't know anything about kindness. She doesn't know anything about family devotion. He doesn't know anything about family devotion. They are just two strangers who are tossed in each other's company. And all of a sudden, they need to figure out what constitutes family. It's fascinating how this novel, among many, many, many other things, also asks the question, what constitutes family? It's fascinating. The only family we encounter in this novel so far, in volume 2, is the Thénardier family. And they are not a happy bunch. And they're not very role model-y as far as parenting goes or families go. And then we have this strange old man, and he's in his 50s. It's amazing. I love this novel because the protagonist of the novel is, you know, middle-aged to an old man for the entirety of the novel. It's not a novel about young, dashing Enjolras of this world. You know, we get them with the Friends of ABC. I mean, we get our glorious, dashing, attractive, mad, brilliant, and super sweet and super infuriating young men who are usually the protagonists of novels in volume 3. But the main character is, at this point, for this historical moment, an old man. People did not live much past 40s, 50s. 60 was ancient old age. And so we have this old man and a small child who are learning to be a family. And it is such a beautiful moment. And at one point, remember, Victor Hugo is all about universal education. And at one point, Jean Valjean remembers that he took the literacy courses in jail because of anger. He has the same motive as the Count of Monte Cristo, right? To learn in order to hit back at the system, or hit back at the, in the case of Jean Valjean, hit back at the system. In the case of the Count of Monte Cristo, hit back at the people who caused his peril. But you see, with Jean Valjean, he took the literacy courses because he wanted to strike back at the system. And he was seeing how the gift of education that he received, that he wanted to use for revenge, is all of a sudden turning into this gift of love, because he started teaching Cosette how to read. And even in this small act, his hardened heart was tamed and was melting into goodness. And those chapters of the two of them just learning to live with each other are amazing. And we entered this very shabby little tenement apartment, and there's only a mattress for Jean Valjean and a little bed for Cosette, and then he creates a little room for her. So he encloses the little space where she sleeps into a little room. Please remember throughout the novel how Jean Valjean arranges Cosette's dwellings. It is just the sweetest thing. I mean, even though he is completely relying on her for all emotional connection, and she is the child he never knew, but he gives this autonomy to her presence in his life, and always sets aside the her space. And I love that about their relationship, even from the very, very start. And so here's the strange man who dresses in rags, who's walking around Paris, was a small child wearing mourning clothes, and he gives to people in need. And it's amazing because some of those people who are the beggars sitting on the streets are police informants. And I mentioned Conan Doyle stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories. It's fascinating to what extent Sherlock Holmes understands how beggars on the street can be both informants for himself. I mean, he often sends little urchins on a mission, and they can provide so much information to him. And often they just do that by sitting on street corners and begging, because that is a great vantage point to observe everything that happens on that street corner. And of course, we're back to Javert, the man who respects the law more than respects the human being. Remember that terrific confrontation between Javert and Jean Valjean in Volume 1, where Jean Valjean is quoting the code from the time of the Republic, and Javert is quoting the code from the time of the Restoration. And Jean Valjean is quoting divine justice, and Javert is quoting human justice. And then finally, Jean Valjean wins because Javert's position was appointed, and Jean Valjean's position was elected. So we have a triumph of electoral democracy over appointed positions, and that just it's terrific to watch, not just theologically, because Cosette feels, Fantine feels that there are two angels fighting for her soul, and it literally is described in those terms. The good and the bad, and the good for Fantine is stunningly also the bad. So just terrifically written theological and spiritual drama unfolding at the same time, as we get all of these extremely useful and important points about legal situation and legal codes and changes in law that has occurred during the time of the Republic and the return of the Republic and the First Empire and return to monarchy. But now these two men meet again. And so the nemesis of Jean Valjean is Javert, and he is curious because he read the notice from the newspaper in Toulon about this prisoner who was known for his physical strength, who helps out a sailor who is caught in the rigging, and then he plummets into the depth of the sea and dies. And his name is Jean Valjean. And so Javert read that article. It's fascinating also that Victor Hugo is not only a writer, but he's also a politician and a journalist. And I love how Victor Hugo uses newspapers in the novel and newspaper announcements. And so it gives this very factual, journalistic authenticity to the story that he's telling us. So that yet another source of inspiration, newspapers. And so Javert knows about this man who died, this man that he has encountered several times in his life. But there's this beggar, there's this, he looks like a beggar, but he gives extraordinary amounts of money to beggars. And he just looks so big and so strong. And so Javert decides to replace his informant on the street corner, the beggar that is an informant for the police. And Jean Valjean looks into those eyes, and the wolves start howling in his soul. He encounters those eyes, and he just feels not good at all. And so that escape from the dragnet that Javert creates for Jean Valjean is so masterfully depicted. It is so terrifying. And then, of course, the escape. One of my former students said, a rope, my kingdom for a rope. And I told him that only Russian peasants would walk around with ropes tied around their waist, because there's always a time in your life when you need a rope. And so that when Jean Valjean was saying that all he needed was a rope, he just needed a rope right now, and how cleverly he snuck up to a lamppost and cut out the rope that was inside the lamppost and was back to Cosette, and he hoisted her up over the wall. And the description of that garden, I mean, it is the Garden of Eden. It is the beginning of everything. And they hear beautiful singing, which is angelic. And then they hear the church bell of the church. And then they hear this very, very strange, lonely bell. And who should it be but the man who was almost crushed by that cart, the man that was saved by Jean Valjean. And Jean Valjean doesn't remember anything. I mean, you have to understand that he's frozen pretty much to death at this point. I mean, they had to stand motionless or lie motionless or be suspended motionless for extended periods of time in absolutely frigid weather conditions. There will be another escape later on, I think in volume 3 or maybe 4, I don't remember at this point, where another person will be escaping from somewhere. And Hugo does just such a great job describing bodies that are dysfunctional because of cold. He even knows that when temperatures are subcomfortable, our bodies just kind of atrophy and our muscles stop working. And so Jean Valjean is not thinking because he is frozen half to death. And he realizes that Cosette needs heat, so he carries her into the little hut, and she's going to be just fine. And he has this amazing conversation with Fauchelevent, and Fauchelevent, he's hilarious. I mean, we finally, some of you are commenting that you did not expect to just have hysterical fits of laughter over some of the characters, and Fauchelevent is our hilarious character because, he's this clever peasant who is probably better educated than most peasants because he had a business that failed. And so he went back to menial work. He's thrilled to be a gardener in this convent because, decent amount of work, but nobody bothers you. All the women run away as soon as you're coming, and you are just left to mind your own business, which is fantastic. And Fauchelevent is saying, well, and Jean Valjean is saying, well, so how will you get us, into the convent? And Fauchelevent is saying, well, it's easy enough to get you into the convent. You're already here. It's a problem getting you out of the convent. And the conversation between Fauchelevent and the Mother Superior, I'm sorry, every time I read through that section, I laugh so hard because they are talking past each other, right? They both have an agenda, and both of them are terrifically illegal. So they know that they are each asking each other to do something a little bit dodgy, a little bit not lawful. And so, the first one just thinks, well, that man, Jean Valjean, or no, he calls him Père Madeleine. That man, Père or Mère Madeleine, he did not stand there by that cart thinking, is this a worthy human being? Do I need to save him from that cart? He just lifted the cart and he didn't ask any questions. So I'm not going to ask any questions either. And then he just barges into the Mother Superior's office and says, I need a helper. I have a brother and he's going to be so helpful. And Mother Superior is like, no, that's not what I wanted you to tell me about. I need you to move a stone. And Fauchelevent is like, yes, and that's why I need my brother, because 2 men are much better at moving stones than 1 man. And then the Mother Superior says, well, you will have the help of nuns. And Fauchelevent says, no, a man is better than a woman when moving stones. I mean, that conversation is just so hilarious because she has her agenda. He has his agenda. She is stubborn and he is stubborn. And they're just talking at cross purposes. They are just, they're both advancing their own agenda. And that's why, and it's masterfully written. Just, Victor Hugo, the humorist. Who knew? And then they finally settle on the fact that they're going to do something terrifically illegal, and they're going to do it against the state. So once again, spiritual and human and church law is going to triumph against the regulations of the state that all of a sudden prohibits the burial of corpses in the crypt under the monastery, under the convent cathedral. And so everything is arranged the way it is arranged. And they find the most masterful way of getting Jean Valjean out of the convent, which is he's a corpse. He's a corpse. And once again, Fourth Level thinks that the gravedigger is his buddy. They're drinking buddies. So, you know, how wonderful it is that they are almost done. They almost succeeded. And then he shows up at the cemetery and says, "Where is the gravedigger?" And then gravedigger says, "He died." And Victor Hugo once again has that nice little humorous aside. How is it possible for a gravedigger to die? You know, that's just not done. And so that whole terrifically drawn out process of trying to convince the new gravedigger to leave, and of course getting Jean Valjean out of his grave. Do you see, those of you who read The Count of Monte Cristo, do you see how the similarities just keep coming and coming and coming? For in volume 2, at the beginning, Jean Valjean plunges into water, so that reminds you of something in The Count of Monte Cristo. And then at the end of volume 2, he rises from the dead, which is also something that happens in The Count of Monte Cristo. So amazing similarities. And in the final moments, I wanted to talk about those two terrific essays, those two asides that Victor Hugo writes, The Battle of Waterloo and On Convent Life. The description of the Battle of Waterloo it has it all. History, psychology, philosophy. It is so astute and so incredibly motivated. I mean, you can see what Victor Hugo is trying to accomplish. He's trying to create a narrative where he says that it wasn't an English victory. It was an act of God. And so he really feels that Waterloo was something ever so much more than a French defeat. For him, it's not a French defeat. It's a deferral of the revolutionary zeal, spirit that was unleashed in France in the early 18th century. And so this terrific monarchist conservative reaction that is unleashed all over Europe after June 18th of 1815 delays the implementation of that which Europe, according to Victor Hugo, was already in the process of accomplishing, which is transitioning from monarchic rule to being republics. And I was actually thinking as I was preparing for this conversation, it's fascinating if you think of all the countries that became a part of Napoleonic France, just like seriously a part of Napoleonic France, are republics today. Italy is a republic, Poland is a republic, Germany is a federal republic, Austria is a republic, Hungary is a republic, Czech Republic, a republic, Slovakia, a republic. Even Russia is a federation, it's a republic. So the vast majority of countries that were at one point part of Napoleonic Empire are republics today. And then the countries that are just on the outskirts of Napoleon's world are still monarchies. He couldn't conquer Spain. It was a disaster. Spain is still a monarchy. He never conquered England, still a monarchy. Norway, Sweden, same there. They were allied, but continental Europe was the stronghold, the Napoleonic stronghold. The continental system implied that it was the core of Europe. And the core of Europe is all governed by presidents and prime ministers and chancellors today. So remarkable. Looking at Europe through the prism of Victor Hugo's essay on how the failure of Waterloo pushed Europe into this conservative reaction that delayed the inevitable. Well, if you look at Europe today through the prism of Victor Hugo's essay, by golly, he was right. Apparently, the core of Europe was dying all to be a republic. It was just delayed by the loss of Waterloo by the French. So masterfully written essay. And it's definitely a Victor Hugo view of history, but it's so much more fun than reading a textbook about the Battle of Waterloo and the description of all of those horses dying in the ravine, and the description of just the mangled bodies. And he does not shy away from the horrors of war, and he talks about all of those horrific wounds that all of those characters sustained. And once again, I pointed out why we read Colonel Chabert by Balzac in April, because I think it was even March. We read that because Colonel Chabert digs himself from a pile of corpses at the Battle of Jena. And it's fascinating. Well, I almost mentioned the character from volume. No, we know him in volume 2. Sorry. Yes, a certain Colonel Pontmercy, who was rescued on the battlefield of Waterloo by a certain person named Thénardier. So a certain Thénardier, who was a camp follower, and camp followers are basically the worst kind of scumbags. They steal from the dead because, you know, like that corpse of Colonel Pontmercy did not need a watch. Somebody had to liberate him from that watch. And that somebody was Thénardier. But it's fascinating how the description of Colonel Chabert extracting himself from these piles of corpses at the Battle of Jena is then resurrected literally in the scene of Colonel Pontmercy and his implausible rescue at the end of the Battle of Waterloo. So do you see how Victor Hugo takes the historical, the general, the broad, and makes it very personal to one character in this novel, and that character is Colonel Pontmercy, who is, of course, the father of our Marius in volume 3. And then so yes, I love that chapter, those chapters about Waterloo, because he makes it French. He makes that loss not a loss but an act of God, and he makes it a French thing that happened, and it was not so much a loss as a lost opportunity, a delay. It was a delayed action that was eventually inevitable. I loved it. And then convent life. It's fascinating that Victor Hugo actually calls that section parentheses. So it's as if, you know what, these chapters are so completely useless for the development of action, but you can skip them because it's in parentheses. But as soon as you said parentheses, we're like, oh, well, you don't want to miss out on this. And so we're absolutely fascinated by everything he has to say about convent life. And when I was teaching my 5-week course on Les Misérables in September, somebody said in the comments, I read that whole section and I have no idea whether Victor Hugo approves of convents or disapproves of convents. And it was such a straightforward question. And the answer is both. I mean, it's amazing how Jean Valjean, when he finally started living in this convent, and he was stunned that it was exactly like penal servitude, but was much less freedom, because, you know, those horrible human beings who committed all of those dreadful crimes at least could be human in their free time. They could swear, you know, they could just kind of like, you know, shake off the chains of oppression and, you know, be awful human beings, which is kind of fun to be. These women were saints, they were angels, and they were not allowed any human traits at all. They could not hug their sisters or mothers when they came to visit, even if they were students in the convent. So there's this horrific dulling and destruction of humanity in the convent. But at the same time, Victor Hugo tells us the entirety of the history of convents to tell us how superbly important they were as places of shelter for women. For, you know, he's writing this in the 19th century, and convent life started being a thing in the 4th century. So like 14, 15 centuries of sanctuary for women specifically. And he does talk a little bit about men's monasteries, but he specifically focuses on women's convents. And I tried to underscore in my commentary just how important convents were specifically for women during times of troubles. And that's pretty much entirety of world history. Women lived longer than men because men died in wars. And so sometimes women were left without any families at all. All of their children died. Sometimes they were left in care of grandchildren without husbands or any middle section of the family. There were no mothers or fathers. There were no grandfathers. There were just grandmothers and children. And it was impossible to survive. You had no source of income, and you went and lived in a convent. So convent was a godsend, literally, for poor women if they had no families and no means of survival. It was a very harsh life, but just think, they got an education. And no, there was no heat in the rooms, but there was a sense of community. There was a sense of sisterhood. They were together with other human beings, and they lived, which is remarkable. Victor Hugo also tells us that some of these women did not live long. They died in their 20s and 30s because life in the convent was harsh, but it was a life. And then on the other hand, aristocratic women often entered convents when life of society became unbearable to them. Especially just think of, let's say you are a princess growing up at court, and it's like, the Game of Thrones all around you. Uncles killing uncles, fathers killing sons, sons killing fathers, everyone killing each other, all to get on the throne. And after a while, some of these princesses would just say, I can't stand this. I absolutely can't stand this. And then I'm going to be used, after everyone murders themselves here, I'm going to be used as a pawn to be given in marriage to someone, just for the sole reason of creating a contract between two countries, a treaty between two countries. I'm going to be a pawn in a treaty game, and I don't want that. And so some of these women would go into convents as a way of just preserving their own sanity, just giving themselves perspective away from the noise of life. Vanity, all this human vanity, all this social vanity would be too much. And sometimes women would stay in court, stay in society, be married to husbands that they did not know or love, deliver the obligatory children who will then be murdering each other for the throne. And then they would say, my role is finished. I married the person I needed to marry. I delivered the children I needed to deliver. I am 30 years old, 35 years old, 40 years old. I can't deal with this anymore. I need peace. And it was a remarkable place of physical sheltering, of spiritual peace, and a sanctuary against the horrors of life, the horrors of everything that was happening outside convent walls. And I'm just eternally grateful to Victor Hugo for giving us this very human and historically accurate aside on convent life, which we never think of at all this day and age. And that's why I pointed out. And when women entered convents, it was a woman's run business. It was a woman's organization because, the head of the organization was a woman, and the medical staff were all women, and the treasurer was a woman, and the warden was a woman. It was a woman's run community. And what did these convents provide all through the centuries? Well, they were nursing homes, they were old folks' homes, they were hospitals, they were soup kitchens, they were poor people's refuge places, and schools. And so it's fascinating how the first women's nursing colleges and women's teachers' colleges, they originated in Protestant countries, Germany and England, especially Germany. Had the first women's colleges and women's like teachers' colleges and women's nursing colleges, because those were the two roles that in Catholic countries were always available for women who wanted to do a life of service: being a nurse in a convent, and being a teacher, like the teachers that little Cosette had. But in Protestant countries, that door was closed for women. They had only one option in life: to get married. And so it's fascinating how after Reformation, it took another 2 centuries, but finally women's colleges started appearing specifically in Protestant countries because women could not lost the option of doing a life of service. So thank you, Victor Hugo, for telling us about the most unusual of places where women existed as equals and ran their own lives for 14 centuries before Victor Hugo wrote that novel. And it's fascinating. Where did women find that in pagan cultures? Well, Greek and Roman mythologies are blessed with so many female goddesses, and all of those goddesses had temples, and all of those temples were run by women. So, you know, Aphrodite in Greece, or Venus in Rome, or Hera in Greece, Juno in Rome, or Athena in Greece, and Minerva in Rome. All of those temples were run by women. And so as Greece and Rome and countries that practiced polytheism switched to monotheism, to Christianity, all of a sudden convents became the replacement for those temples, where women could be themselves, run their own business, and live a life of service and a life of peace. So thank you, Victor Hugo. Once again, I'm just eternally grateful for that aside, because we do not talk about the positive role that convents have played through the centuries, like ever, in today's day and age. And we still have, you know, we still have sororities. I mean, students live in sororities in colleges. The United States has still women's colleges. United States still has girls' Catholic schools, women's clubs, women's organizations. So women still do stuff away from men in very, very, very large numbers, and very prolifically, even in the 21st century. And all that is a remnant of convent life and convent structures that were developed by brave women for centuries. So yes, I think I will stop here. I see a hand, and I will attempt to answer your questions. Jean, it's you. Hi.
Hi, Anna. I wanted to thank you for your incredible generosity and all of the time that you must put into this, and just tell you how much joy the whole thing gives me. And every time I'm reading, and especially reading your comments, looking at the paintings, listening to the music, I think I want everyone I know to be enjoying this. And it's just such an antidote for our digital world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to scoot in a minute, but you made me, I wanted to ask you about the recurrence of important coins in this novel.
Oh my gosh, yes. So what I'm going to do is, okay, how did I get so smart about Les Misérables? I read a book about Les Misérables. I didn't just read the book, I read a book about the book. And that book was an eye-opener for me. And that book contains an entire chapter on coin usage in the novel, which befuddles me beyond belief, because sometimes coin values and middle class, upper class, and lower class people have different names and different value assigned to the same coins. And this book describes this incredibly complex system of money that existed in France in the 19th century. So I was planning on doing that, and thank you for reminding me. I don't have the book with me right now, but as soon as I have the book, I'm going to literally take photos of those pages and post them on our page, so that you will still not understand how they did it. I don't. I read that chapter 3 times, just with my mouth gaping wide open and thinking, how did these people deal with money when all of them not just had, it's not that they had, like, you know, buck, dollar. I mean, it's not that. It's not that they had different names for the same value coin. They ascribe different monetary value to these coins. And that's what makes it so confusing. So I don't understand the coinage system in this novel at all.
I gathered that that it really made an impression on somebody if he produced a gold coin, and the coin that the shepherd boy dropped, that Jean Valjean put his foot on, and then Cosette dropping the coin out of her pocket, and then the coin that Jean Valjean puts in the shoe. And I read ahead, and there's more coins coming,
Yes,
but
Thank you for the
Thénardier,
question.
when
And
he
I'm going to literally post photos
Yeah.
of those pages from the book. And the book is called The Novel of the Century, and it's how the novel was written. Please don't read it now. The first 10 pages give the summary of the entire novel. So this is a book for someone who just read the novel and all of a sudden wants to just go into the stratosphere, like understanding this novel. So I'll definitely post those chapters. And then if there are no other questions, if there are questions, I would like to answer them, but I want to add one more thing to my commentary. So we have the wonderful Waterloo essay, and we have the wonderful convent essay, but we also have a sweet little line that that Victor Hugo adds, and he says just before Jean Valjean and Cosette begin their escape, and remember, they don't bring Catherine when they're escaping. That doll was very, very large, and so they leave Catherine. Catherine does not come to the convent with them, and that's the sort of the cheap shortcut that all of the movies make. Catherine is in the convent, and Catherine is there at the end of the novel, or at the end of the film, and Catherine is left behind when they're escaping. So we have to say tearful goodbye to Catherine, and Cosette, every once in a while remembers her. But Victor Hugo says one thing: the author of this novel has not been to Paris for a long time, and the author of this novel is relying on friends who have checked these neighborhoods. And so some of you actually started posting the locations of the novel as they are today. And Saint-Sulpice, the church, I've been to that church several times. It's absolutely amazing. So it's just so thrilling that the church where Marius finds out about how much his father loved him is a church that I love in Paris. But Victor Hugo has not been to Paris for a long time when he was writing this novel. Because remember, I keep teasing you and I keep dangling it in front of you, and I keep saying Victor Hugo did not live in Paris for 18 years. After 1851, he had to escape in 1852. Remember, 51 is the year that is never mentioned because Napoleon III usurps power. France stops being a republic. It was the Second Republic. Today it's in its fifth republic. So the Second Republic before Napoleon III, and he usurps power, and Victor Hugo publishes that essay, a pamphlet, Napoleon le Petit. He calls Napoleon the Little, because his uncle, Napoleon I, is the Great, and that infuriates Napoleon. And there's a warrant for Victor Hugo's arrest, and his lover, Juliette, smuggles him out of the country with a false passport. And he first goes to Belgium, and then he decides to settle. So this is it. I'm going to give it away to you because you're here on the Zoom. And then eventually, when I have time, I'm going to write that whole comment about Victor Hugo, the politician, and Victor Hugo, the exile. He will go to the Channel Islands. They are located off the coast of Normandy. Since the time of the Norman conquest of England, even though the Channel Islands are right off the coast of France, are under English jurisdiction. So when William the Conqueror came and conquered England from Normandy, those islands became a part of England, and they are still a part of England. So Victor Hugo was an island dweller for 18 years. First, he lived on the island of Jersey, and then he settled on the island of Guernsey in St. Peter Port. And the house where he wrote Les Misérables is Hauteville House in St. Peter Port, Jersey, on the Channel Islands under English jurisdiction. Victor Hugo never learned any English. He did not like England at all, as you can tell from the beginning of volume 2 of Les Misérables. It's not an English victory. Remember, it's an act of God. And so, but it's amazing that this man settled as close to the English coast as possible. and he was an island exile. Even after Napoleon III declared amnesty for everyone who opposed his usurpation of power, Victor Hugo stayed in gloriously proud isolation. He was the most famous French intellectual in opposition to Napoleon III. And it was only in 1870, remember Les Misérables is published in 1862. So Victor Hugo is 5 years older than Napoleon III. And, you know, so 51, the evil year, usurpation happened. 52, Victor Hugo has to run away from France. 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. Victor Hugo starts feeling like this man is going to stay in power, and I am 5 years older. And he starts feeling that perhaps this man is going to outlast him. And that is why Les Misérables is finished. It's a giant in your face to the man in power. From an exile who is the conscience of a nation living in exile. That is why this novel is everything. This is the most French of French novels that includes absolutely everything there is to know about Frenchness, precisely because it's the sum total of what it means to be French when you cannot be French. Can you imagine for the consummate Parisian like Victor Hugo to live on an island surrounded by fishing villages for 18 years. He did travel. He traveled in like what is now Holland and Belgium. He was a huge collector of art. His house on Guernsey is, to say that it's over decorated, it's a pathetic understatement. But he wrote this novel as a punch in the face of political usurpation. It was his response to Napoleon III. Isn't this marvelous? Just so marvelous. And so the novel is published, and it is the hugest explosion in European political life ever in 1862. And then we still have 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. Napoleon III is still the emperor. And Victor Hugo is stubbornly staying on that island. Do you see how political stubbornness of a certain character in volume 3 is also very much so the political stubbornness of Victor Hugo, who just would not change his opinions, right? And then Napoleon III gets himself involved in the Franco-Prussian War, and he is actually captured by the Prussians. And when Napoleon III is captured by the Prussians, it's 1870, Victor Hugo comes back to Paris. At this point, surrounded by Prussian troops, there is starvation in Paris. It is absolutely a catastrophic moment in Paris's history. And isn't it marvelous that Victor Hugo, the greatest lover of Paris, comes back to Paris when it's encircled by a foreign military, Prussians, and he comes back to Paris in her hour of greatest need. And then, of course, 1871, there's another revolution in Paris. It's the Paris Commune. And Victor Hugo will be hiding some of the revolutionaries, and he will be sending them to Belgium to safety. And after the revolution is over, France becomes a third republic, and Victor Hugo becomes promptly its senator. So it's the most marvelous life. He was a member of the House of Peers. He was a member of the convention. So he was politician 3 different times under 3 different governments. And a man who was born in a republic will die in a republic, the conscience of France. So amazing. Just put that knowledge of the fact that Les Misérables was a terrific political act. It was an act of a writer who knew how to strike at the powers that be, by writing the novel that beat the powers that be. And so, marvelous. Just everything about this book is it's just legendary. It's so colossal. That's why we are struggling so much with this book. Now you understand that our struggle is completely built into the structure of this novel, because this novel is unembraceable. I mean, like what we are doing, just reading 4 chapters a day, it's impossible. It's just impossible to embrace the unembraceable. This novel is the sum total of what it means to be not just a human being, but what it means to be a French human being. So there you have it. 3 cheers for Victor Hugo. All right, any other questions? And I'm so glad I had that question about the coins, because I absolutely will. In about next weekend, I'm going to get hold of that book. I hope I didn't mark it up because as I was reading it, I could not believe it. And then I realized that that book is available on Audible. So I downloaded it, and then I read it, and then I listened to it, and then I read it again. And that book is just as unbelievable as Les Miserables, but it gives you so much information about how and why this novel was written, and all of these intricate little details of Victor Hugo's personal life in this book, and the personal life of this book in the continuity of French history. So thank you, Victor Hugo. And then on to volume 3. So much stuff is going on in volume 3. I'm breathless. I cannot embrace that volume, and all of those friends of the ABC. I mean, those young men, we're in love with absolutely all of them, because they are so awful and so fantastic at the same time. They're just these demigods who stride the streets of Paris and make the most outrageous pronouncements that they don't really mean sometimes, but they are 22 and 23, and they're gorgeous and smart, and they think that they know everything and they can solve every problem. And if any one of you have ever dealt with 21, 22, 23-year-olds who have read way too many books and who are tall and proud and they know that they can save the world, I mean, they're just impossible to deal with, but humanity cannot move on without young people like that. And so 3 cheers for the impossible 22-year-olds. All right, well, we'll end here. And we're going to finish volume 3 soon, so we'll do another Zoom. And I will absolutely, before we finish this novel, post an extra post on Victor Hugo the politician, Victor Hugo the playwright and poet, and the other novels he wrote, Victor Hugo the exile, and everything there is to know about St. Peter Port, Guernsey, and Hauteville House, and the 3 most important women. And when I said that there were hundreds of women, there were hundreds of women. I mean, and he took notes. So, but there were those 3, the wife, the mistress that he kept for 50 years, and another very important mistress. So all of that will be posted at some point. I'm teaching more students this semester in my university life than I've ever taught before. And I'm constantly reading papers and tests. I'm drowning. It's midterm time. And I have all of these kids who I read 48 papers, 48 tests, and then 17 papers times 3. So that's the last 2 weeks for me, and I still have papers and tests to read. So I'm drowning with all of that fun stuff. But some of you asked me what I'm teaching in my other classes. I taught the Epic of Gilgamesh, Book of Job. We talked about some of the books from the Odyssey. And then in my Russian class, we just finished Pushkin, and we are reading Gogol, and pretty soon we are going to move on to Chekhov. So in addition to loving Victor Hugo, I'm loving all of those other guys. So fun times. But yes, I'm going to prepare those essays and the all-important photographs from the book that talk about money conversions. When you're going to read that, you will just scratch your heads like for the longest time, and you'll be saying to yourselves, how did those French people at all were capable of making any monetary transactions? It's incomprehensible to me. So thank you for that question. All right, I'll talk to you later. Happy reading. Bye-bye.